Now, this particular hockey stick graph shows underneath it that sort of grey area, appropriately foggy looking. That is the Hadley Centre's temperature record, global mean surface temperature, for the past 150 years. And you will see that they have imposed upon that stochastic record 4 arbitrarily chosen trend lines, starting at places that suited them. The plain intention of this graph, which is explicitly stated in the 3 places in the document where it is used large and in full colour, is to try to show that the rate of global warming is itself accelerating, with the stated implication that we are to blame. Now, when I saw this graph, I realised at once that it was bogus. Anyone who has taken Statistics 101 knows that you may not put multiple trend lines on the same stochastic data set with arbitrarily chosen start points and then draw any conclusions whatsoever as to the trend or acceleration or deceleration in trend of the data by reference to the relationships between the slopes of the different trend lines. That is an old and entirely impermissible statistical fraud. So when I saw it, I thought we should confront IPCC with it. So I went to Copenhagen and was appalled to find the whole place covered in green socialist banners everywhere, which rather implausibly said, "Brad Pitt saves the planet." And there I found Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, who is the chairman of the IPCC. Did I hear somebody hissing there? Yes, I think I did. Can't you hiss louder than that? Now, of course, we mustn't be unfair to dear Dr. Pachauri, because he's not a climate scientist. He's a railroad engineer. He's the Casey Jones of the IPCC. And, of course, he was giving in his lecture at the University of Copenhagen, among other things, this graph. And he was saying, this is illustrating that the problem is getting worse. So I knew he would use this graph. So I took him a 10-page letter explaining in words of one syllable why this graph is wrong. It's very difficult when you're explaining climatology to a railroad engineer. But anyway, I did my best. And he said, that is a very deep point that you are making. I said, no, it's a very elementary point that I'm making. The graph is bogus, it is fraudulent, and I'm going to give you 2 days to withdraw that graph and make sure that a correction is published on the IPCC's website, or I'm going to report you for criminal fraud to the public authorities. And he said, fraud is a very strong word. And I said, Dr. Pachauri, fraud is a very serious crime, and I'm going to report you for it unless I see some evidence of good faith from you in getting this graph corrected. And he was hustled out of the room, and the meeting was brought rather hastily to an end, to the cheers of the audience, many of whom were friends of mine who had happened to come along for the event. And so a week later, I always give them longer than I say I will, because you've got to be kind. A week later, I wrote to the Charity Commission in the United Kingdom, because Rajendra Pachauri is at the moment, the sole trustee of a charity called TERI Europe, the Tatar Industries Research Institute. And that charity has filed accounts for the last 4 years. You can see them ringed with a very low income, indeed below £10,000 in each of the years, £26,000 in total. And I happened to be trawling in a nerdish sort of way through the government's websites in the UK, and here is the Department of Food and Rural Affairs and Silly Walks, and what it shows is a grant of more than £30,000 in just one of the 4 years concerned to TERI Europe. So I pointed out to the Charity Commission that these are the figures that appeared on its own website and that this is what appeared on the government's website. And I said, should I be reporting this to the police as criminal false accounting? Within 2 days, the Charity Commission had got in touch. They said, we have checked with the charity. It has accepted that it filed false accounts. It will be providing true accounts, and we will then be deciding whether or not and whom we will prosecute for the false accounting that has plainly arisen. So when Steve McIntyre says we shouldn't use words like fraud, yes, we should when fraud is plain and evident, and I don't think that anyone should be immune from prosecution for fraud just because they have diplomatic immunity, because they are, as a railroad engineer, the head of the UN's climate panel. So back to this bogus graph. What I decided to do was to find out what it was they were trying to hide. So I removed Railroad Engineers Pachauri's railroad lines from the graph, cleared them all away, and here is the graph again. And this time I have added 2 lines of my own. These are trend lines which I have arbitrarily chosen. And as you will see, the trend line from 1905 to 2005 is rising at only half the rate of the trend line from 1905 to 1945. Thank goodness, global warming is slowing down. Now, we're going to do science like the IPCC does science. We're going to take a vote. What we're going to do is we're going to say, how many of you say that this graph is correct? Not even one. No, very good. And how many of you say that this graph is correct? Come on, let's see. Well, I usually begin my talks by saying that you should never believe a word I say, because, of course, this graph is just as bogus as the other graph. I have used the same bogus statistical technique on the same data with different starting points and have come to a precisely opposite result, from which it logically follows that the technique itself is bogus. QED. So, what then is the truth? We now know what isn't the truth. What is the truth? Well, here it is. There were 3 periods of rapid warming over the last 160 years. 1860 to 1880, 1910 to 1940, and 1975 to 2001. And as you can see, they are strictly parallel rates of warming. And even if you don't do it by the eyeball method, and you do the least squares linear regression trend on the data over those periods, they are indeed strictly parallel. And to check that, I got Roger Harrabin of the BBC, who has been at this conference, to ask Dr. Jones of the Hadley Centre of the CRU to confirm that these 3 rates of warming are strictly parallel, and in particular that the 3rd and most recent rate of warming is no higher than the other 2. And Phil Jones, for at heart he is an honest soul, said, yes, it is true. There has been no acceleration in the warming rate. They are 3 strictly parallel rates of warming. And that made a news story, believe it or not, because somehow none of them had managed to say that before. To make assurance doubly sure, I had a question put down in the House of Lords. I don't have a seat and I don't have a vote, but I do have a voice. So I put the question down. And the answer came back from the government through gritted teeth that indeed the 3 rates of warming were indeed parallel, but that nevertheless the government's policy was that we were going to bankrupt the British and European economies by pursuing the same old policies, regardless of any mere data that got in the way. Or words to that effect. And so what I thought was, let's check once more. You have to check everything so many times in science. So I got in touch with Senator Vitter's office. And I said, would you mind writing to Dr. Holdren and asking him? And Dr. Holdren wrote back saying, yes, the first two are parallel at 0.16 Kelvin per decade, but the third one is 0.23 Kelvin per decade, a 50% increase in the warming rate. Now, he must have known that if he was using the same data as the IPCC, which is the Hadley data, that simply was not true. Now, I regard it as a very serious matter that a paid public official of your administration should write what appears to me to be a deliberate and conscious falsehood to a senator making a straightforward scientific inquiry. And I hope that this failure to get the facts right on the part of the administration will in future cease, because from now on a lot more scientific questions are going to be directed by both houses of Congress to this administration's scientific team, and they will expect that those questions will in future be fully and honestly and accurately answered. Now, we cannot explain what caused the first two of these three periods of warming because we didn't have enough ways of measuring at the time. We know that the warming happened. You can see it is a 60-year periodicity or quasi-periodicity, almost certainly related in some way to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which shows a similar periodicity. But we can try to work out what it was that caused the third and most recent period of warming. And as you will see, that third and most recent period of warming accounts for very nearly all of the warming that has occurred since 1950. The warming which we are told by IPCC was chiefly caused by us. However, in this period, which is the satellite era, and you can see I've marked it there with a green line representing 1983, where we first had satellites measuring not only temperature but also radiation and clouds. So I then looked around the literature to try and find out whether there was anything that explained why we got a sudden increase in warming, just as we appear to have done twice before. And I came across this paper by Dr. Pinker and her colleagues, which shows that there was a general global brightening from 1983, when the satellites first went up there, until 2001, and that global brightening was the equivalent of 2.9 watts per square metre of extra sunlight reaching the Earth because there were fewer clouds in the way during that period. You do not gasp with astonishment, but you should, because according to IPCC, the entire anthropogenic influence, admittedly at the top of the atmosphere rather than at the surface, in watts per square metre, for the whole of the 256 years from 1750 until 2005 was just 1.6 watts per square metre. So here we have an enormous influence naturally occurring. We can tell it's natural because it doesn't track with the monotonic increases in CO2. The temperature record is clearly stochastic, and these sudden surges in temperature are not caused by CO2. They are clearly natural. And this natural warming, I wondered, how much warming would 2.9 watts per square metre cause? So I did some sums and found that 2.9 watts per square metre would cause so much warming that it would have caused more than all the warming since 1950. So then we produced the result. And the result is this. If Dr. Pinker's, if we take just 30% of Dr. Pinker's forcing, the radiation coming down to the Earth, then the UN would appear to have overestimated climate sensitivity almost fivefold. And if you go anything above 35% of Dr. Pinker's quite carefully measured value, there is no room for any of the greenhouse gases to have had any influence whatsoever. And that, I suggest, is what they were trying to hide by putting all those railroad lines on the graph. And you might want to know what has happened since the end of the UN's graph in 2001. Well, here it is. For the last 9 full years, there has been a very slight, not statistically significant, decline in global mean surface temperature. And there you see the actual data, which is a combination of the RSS and UAH records, just the same as Roy Spencer had this morning. The difference is that this graph goes down and his goes up, and I'll explain why. Because his graph was confined to land data, where because of the urban heat island effect and other influences, there has been a slight rise in temperature over the period, and this is global, including the oceans, where there has been a slight decline.